Hey everybody, today's notes, focus notes number 2, title is The Path to the Supreme Court. So we're going to kind of go through these fairly quickly, and you should have some time to continue working on your Constitutional Freedoms and Rights study guide. So Path to the Supreme Court is our title. Question number 1, what are the two court systems in the United States? So here we see our old friend federalism, right? We have dual court systems in the US. So every state has their own court system, and there's also a federal court system, which includes the Supreme Court. So in the state court systems, the powers of those courts come from state constitutions and laws. So if you go into Minneapolis and you go into St. Paul, you will find federal courts, and the Minnesota State Supreme Court is at the Capitol building. So if you are charged with a crime in the state of Minnesota and you have to go to, you get charged under a state law, you would go to a state court. And there's different layers of court depending on the severity of the situation. We have a system in Minnesota very much like the federal system, where if you think that your rights have been violated, you can appeal the decision of that court to Minnesota State Appeals Courts, and it can go to the Minnesota State Supreme Court. So it's kind of the same system that you see modeled on the federal side. We also have a federal court system. There are lower federal courts that were established by Congress, as well as the Supreme Court. And the same kind of thing happens there. If you get charged with a federal crime, or if you're involved in other kinds of matters, in some cases it would be challenges to things that are going on, you might end up in federal court if it's a federal situation. And same kind of thing can happen there. The powers in federal courts come from the U.S. Constitution and federal laws. So if we go to our second question, which court do you go to, state or federal? That comes back to jurisdiction. Who has the authority to hear a case? Okay, so if we're talking about state courts, it would be state jurisdiction. So I told you in the last set of notes that the original trial is where original jurisdiction happens. And the trial court that has original jurisdiction depends on which laws are involved, right? So why we care about this is because we're going to be, after break, you're going to be taking a Supreme Court case and kind of tracking it through the justice system. And there's different paths that cases can take to get to the Supreme Court. They might go through the state side or the federal side, depending on what's going on. But there is an original trial somewhere. That court has original jurisdiction. We know that language by now. State courts will hear cases that involve state laws. Federal courts will hear cases involving federal laws, right? That seems pretty obvious. They also will hear cases that are somehow related to the Constitution. So if I think that what happened to me was a violation of my First Amendment freedom of speech rights, and I had some situation with the school district, I might go to court originally in state, or it could go right into a federal court if I'm challenging it under constitutional grounds. More on that later. We will see examples of those when we start getting into the cases. The other thing that shows up in federal courts would be issues related to something the federal government is involved in. We said last time, if it's something where there's some conflict between states, or if there's something happening, where the federal government needs to intervene in state issues, or something involving the federal government, it would show up in federal courts. So we just said the court where the case is originally tried is called the trial court. That's original jurisdiction in the trial court. If you don't like the ruling of the original court and you have a basis for an appeal, you may appeal the decision. And that means you're asking a higher court to review what that decision was. Okay, so basis for an appeal. What is the basis for an appeal? It would typically be something involving the protections that show up in the Constitution, typically things in the Bill of Rights or the 14th Amendment. Okay, some courts only have appellate jurisdiction, meaning they only hear appeals. That's their whole purpose. We said in the first set of notes that the Supreme Court is unique because it has both original and appellate jurisdiction, even though most of the time they're hearing appeals. Okay, so we're trying to just keep using this language so that the kinds of things we're talking about start to make sense when you hear this language being used. When you're reading about your case, they're going to be using this kind of language and showing you the path that the case took to get to the Supreme Court. So back to kind of a diagram that shows the different ways that this can work. If I have a situation that starts in the state trial court, and there's courts across all the 50 states, I might ask for an appeal, ask a higher court to review that decision, and I could end up in an intermediate appellate court. That's part of the state system, and I could end up in Minnesota State Supreme Court. If I still don't agree with what happened in the Supreme Court of Minnesota, I can ask the U.S. Supreme Court to review the Minnesota Supreme Court's decision. So what you'll see sometimes in the cases that we look at are that these, to get to the Supreme Court, there might have been multiple times that this case popped up before it got there. If you start on the federal side, if you're in one of the U.S. district courts, in your original case or your original trial, you could appeal to a series of U.S. courts of appeal, and there are 13 circuits. We'll see a map here in a second that shows that. And if I still don't agree with that decision, I could appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, remember we said the Supreme Court only gets a very small percentage of all the cases that are appealed to it. So if I have a decision on let's say the U.S. Court of Appeal, and I lose in that case, I could appeal to the Supreme Court. If they don't do anything, I'm stuck with whatever this decision was. Same thing happens over here. If my case goes to the Minnesota Supreme Court and I lose, and I want to appeal to the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, if they don't take my case, I'm stuck with whatever that last decision was. Okay, so kind of understanding this is important to see how this whole system functions. The Minnesota has 4 federal district courts. There's one in St. Paul, one in Minneapolis, and then 2 in other parts of the state, one in Duluth and one in Fergus Falls. So if you're outstate, you're either driving to Duluth or Fergus Falls, unless you're closer to the city. If we look at the U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals, we said they were kind of spread out over the country. This is probably based on the number of people in each of these places, right? So because population is more dense in the East Coast, you will see, like New York and Pennsylvania and Delaware. That's just one of these circuits. Our circuit is this one in orange. So if anything is going through the U.S. appeals courts out of any of these states, they will go to circuit courts in that region. So the question that you're going to need to know for our work after break is, how do you get to the U.S. Supreme Court? Most U.S. Supreme Court cases involve appellate jurisdiction. I've said that now several times. So the cases are coming from lower courts of appeal. So they could be on the state side or the federal side. They can also be appealed from the highest court of a state, but only if the claim is under federal law or the Constitution's involved. So all of the cases we're going to look at, people are going to be arguing that their First Amendment rights were violated in some way, or their Fourth Amendment rights were violated, or their Eighth Amendment rights are being violated. We're going to really focus in on the stuff that shows up in the Bill of Rights. And so that chart that we're working on is going to be useful so that we can kind of understand the constitutional piece of this. And then this is just another picture of that same thing, the different paths that we can take to get to the Supreme Court. That is it for our notes today. I would suggest using your time to continue working on the study guide. If you can get into the Fifth and Sixth Amendments for sure. And if not, push your way into the Eighth Amendment so that we can work towards getting the far left column and the middle column filled in. And then after break, we will come back and we will be looking at the court cases on the far right side. So skip those again and just work on the far left and the middle columns. That's it for today. I hope you have a good afternoon.